Well, the really short story is that Cecilia's, first husband beat her, and it was the second husband who killed her,
Mhm.
and it was a particularly brutal murder,
Uh-huh.
a very horrific murder. So, she had bad luck or
Uh-huh.
made bad choices in her husbands. The first husband was my great-grandfather,
Okay.
would have been, my mom's grandfather.
Uh-huh. Okay. And then she got married again and then
She got
murdered.
married again.
Ooh, goodness. You heard that right. Author of The Potato Masher Murder, Gary Sosniecki, talk about his great-grandmother Cecilia's brutal murder at the hands of her second husband, Albin Ludwig. More into that later, but first, welcome to Round the Bend Now and Then, a podcast that shines a light on the South Bend and Mishawaka area. Through interviews with local business owners, leaders, and community members, our listeners and I learn together about all of the great people and great things going on in our community, as we also learn about South Bend and Mishawaka's history and how intertwined our past is with our present. At the very start of the episode, you heard Gary Sosniecki discuss his great-grandmother Cecilia's death and how horrific it was. In this episode, you'll hear exactly how awful it was, even by today's standards. A few years ago, Gary wrote about his great-grandmother Cecilia's death in a book titled The Potato Masher Murder: Death at the Hands of a Jealous Husband. Now, you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with a podcast related to the South Bend and Mishawaka area? Well, this brutal murder took place 117 years ago in a brand new neighborhood in the 200 block of East Marion Street in Mishawaka, Indiana, in a house that happens to be still standing. Gary's book is about an intriguing but obviously sad tale of jealousy, anger, and ultimately a brutal murder. Now, I highly encourage our listeners to go out and read his book because if you're like me and you love our local history, this book does a wonderful job of painting a picture of what turn-of-the-century downtown Mishawaka was like. I mean, the entire book is littered with historical references, street names, etc. And then you throw in the wild murder in the brand new Marion Street neighborhood. I had to get Gary on the podcast and hear it straight from him. Now, obviously, it's impossible to tell the whole story in one podcast episode, so I highly recommend that you go out and get his book. And Gary explains later on exactly where you can do that. In this episode, you'll hear Gary and I discuss his great-grandmother's murder, what the scene was like around her Mishawaka home that day, a surprise visit to what Gary thought was the murder scene, and then a few of the ups and downs of researching, writing, and ultimately publishing a book about it. I recently met with Gary virtually from his home in the Ozarks in Missouri. And as you'll hear, that definitely is not the only place that he's lived. Next, before we dive into the story of his great-grandmother Cecilia's death, I share with Gary how I discovered his book, and then I ask him a little bit about himself. The background with me finding your book, I think I was on a Facebook history page or something, and I saw the Potato Masher Murder: Death at the Hands of a Jealous Husband. I obviously clicked on it to see what was up, and I saw Mishawaka, Indiana. I had no clue about this, and so I bought the book, read it. This was a few years ago. Then fast forward to I don't know, a month or so ago. I let my mom borrow the book, and then so she had given it back to me. That's when I took a picture of the book and tweeted it on my Round the Bend 574 Twitter account, because I'm always want to lift up local books and businesses and things like that. So I tweeted it, and then you had responded pretty much right away, and I said, "Wow, I'm starting a podcast. Let's see if we can invite Gary on." And so here we are. So first, thank you.
Well, you're welcome. My first comment would be, did your mom like it?
Yeah, she did. She's a
Okay,
history buff. She's a history
good.
buff like me, especially local history. So anytime you read something that we recognize, street names and things like that, it's just engaging. Plus, this is quite the crime. So it's
Yes, it was. Yeah.
all right. Before we begin, Gary, let's just talk about a little bit about yourself, maybe your career, background, and all those things.
I'm a native of the Chicago suburbs, and I went to college at the University of Missouri to study journalism
Uh-huh.
and met my wife in copy editing class. We got married on graduation day and graduated in the morning and got married in the afternoon. Our parents met each other for the first time, and multitaskers from the beginning.
Wow.
We worked for a daily newspaper in Jackson, Tennessee. Then we
Uh-huh.
worked for competing newspapers in Southern Illinois. And then we started buying our own newspapers. And we bought our first weekly newspaper in a town of 907 people,
Wow.
and just about as many loose dogs. And, and we owned that and for 6 years, and went out
Okay.
to Kansas for a couple years, came back to Missouri, bought another weekly newspaper, a little bit bigger town. We were
Uh-huh.
there 10.5 years, and we sold that one to a fellow who owns a daily newspaper. It
Uh-huh.
was a daily newspaper in the town where we happen to be living now.
Right.
We ran that for 4 years, and then we bought another weekly newspaper in yet a bigger town and had that for 4 years. Then went up to Iowa. If you're familiar with American Pickers on TV,
Absolutely.
we lived in the town where American Pickers, where Mike Wolf has
Okay.
a store. You see that on LeClaire, Iowa.
Yeah.
And we were there for 8 years. I worked across the river at a major company that sells digital products to the newspaper industry. And then we
Okay.
retired 7 years ago, came back to Missouri.
And you're living the dream now.
We are, yeah. Spent 4 years working on a book and a year and a half promoting it.
So how long have you been married?
It'll be 50 years this May.
Beautiful. What an absolute blessing. Seriously, 50 years. That's beautiful. I can't,
Thank you.
you can't say anything more than that. My parents are going on about 47 years, and then my wife's parents are about the same. And we thank our lucky stars being blessed with both of our families. Both of our parents have been married for that long. It's just a blessing. So congrats.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Wow, 50 years. Definitely a blessing. Decades and decades. It was also decades and decades that Gary's family kept hush-hush about Cecilia's murder. As you'll hear next, he didn't talk about it with his mother, Cecilia's granddaughter, until 1996. And as you'll also hear, as a kid, he spent some time with his grandfather, Cecilia's son, and not once did he mention anything about his mother being murdered in Mishawaka, Indiana. At the beginning of the book, you had mentioned that you didn't learn about the murder until 1996 from your mother, and then the details were still vague.
Yeah, well, I mean, my little brother and I have talked about this. We would hear talk about something having happened.
Uh-huh.
Growing up, we'd hear maybe at Thanksgiving or Christmas dinners with our grandparents,
Uh-huh.
and we would kind of hear things, but we knew almost nothing about it. And finally, in 1996 is when I got my mom to talk a little bit about it.
Wow. And then your mom would have been Cecilia's
It'd be
granddaughter?
Cecilia's granddaughter, right?
And then you had mentioned your grandfather, which is Cecilia's son.
My grandfather was Cecilia's son.
And you had
Right.
mentioned him hanging out with him like in Chicago as a child, and he really never
Yeah.
said anything.
He took me to Cub games.
Wrigley Field, God,
We
love
sat
it.
once behind home plate at Wrigley Field. I think there were $3 tickets back then.
Uh-huh.
And right in the first row, and my grandma had told me on the when I left with him, don't let him stop at any taverns. Well, we stopped at a tavern, and then we got to the ball game, and she was able to count the number of beers that he drank because he would put the beer on the wall there behind home plate. So
And he never said a word about his mother being murdered, huh?
no, he would have been 14. He would have been 14 years old when it happened.
Okay. One of the things that stood out in my head most of the time that I was reading the book was what that entire scene must have looked like in turn-of-the-century Mishawaka, Indiana. To get a picture of where this occurred, the 200 block of East Marion Street is right off of Main Street near the old Battelle School, which is now Battelle Apartments. Marion Street literally runs parallel with the Grand Trunk Railroad tracks there, so their backyards are very close to the tracks. Now that neighborhood is an old one with lots of homes that are very close together. But in 1906, it was a new subdivision, and only a handful of homes were on Marion Street. Main Street wasn't even named Main Street yet north of the river, as it was called Bridge Street. And it wasn't even paved yet. The now historic Main Street Bridge was just being built, so I'm sure nobody in the Princess City could have imagined the scene inside and outside of that house on Marion Street. Next, you'll hear Gary describe the scene inside of the house on that fateful day. Love to kind of get your thoughts about the actual crime and some of the events that surround the murder. And while I want my listeners to read the book, so we don't have to go through every single detail about it. I really, as I'm reading it, I just wow. Some of my wow moments. The first one. Now, listeners, this is turn of the century Mishawaka, Indiana, and the scene. I just couldn't imagine that scene. Talk to me about what that scene would have looked like.
The fire chief opened the door to the closet,
Uh-huh.
the walk-in closet, what today we'd call walk-in closet, and discovered a body on the floor. He said, he testified that she looked like a real half-baked chicken.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my great-grandmother, Cecilia Henderson Hornberg Ludwig, who was dead on the floor there. The fire department was called to the scene without talking about the different scenarios of what may have happened. The fire department was called to the scene between 1:30 and 2:30 on this Tuesday afternoon, when neighbors saw smoke coming out of the upstairs window, and the front door was locked. So they went through another upstairs window with a hose, and they had what basically was a type of fire extinguisher from that era, and they saw smoke. And they saw a man on a bed who was all bloody.
Okay.
And that would be Alvin, and
right.
and he was suffering from cuts. And so what in the world's going on here?
Right.
So they managed to extinguish this fire in the closet. They discover it's coming from the closet. They open the closet door, and it's going to the roof and putting that out. They put the fire out, and there's this charred body of a woman, nude charred body of a woman on the floor. And they're amazing. Like, it seems like half the town saw her there, because there was very little security then. But so that was the scene. You've got the bloody husband on the bed, and you've got the dead wife on the floor of the walk-in closet.
Whew. Man, imagine that. Smoke is detected in one of just a few of the new houses in a new housing development. The firemen show up, probably thinking they're just going to extinguish a fire, and they discover a charred body in the closet, and then a man who was all sliced up and bloodied. Imagine being that firefighter. Definitely not your normal early 1900s Mishawaka fire. When you read about Albin's wounds in the book, it's pretty descriptive. Next, I asked Gary to elaborate about those wounds. You mentioned Albin was bloody. Talk to me about how he got bloodied.
Well, we believe that Albin sliced himself up to make it look like self-defense. That he had a razor. They found a razor, an old-fashioned razor on the floor. And when I did my book presentations, I had all these props, like including a potato masher. That I did not have a razor.
You did not have a rusty razor, no.
But he sliced himself up on the neck and the arms and the legs, and one of the wounds on his leg was 3 inches deep.
Ugh.
So he apparently thought to make it look like Cecilia had done this to him.
Uh-huh.
That would have been impossible.
Right.
But that's how they found him on the bed.
Oh, man. Again, what a gory thing to discover. Whew. Well, that's what the firemen discovered inside of the house. But imagine being a neighbor or a townsperson at that time outside of the house, because that was quite a scene as well. Then the scene outside of the house, as I'm reading it, again, I'm just picturing turn of the century, Mishawaka, Indiana, Marion Street. Our listeners right now, if you're familiar, it's more of a neighborhood with houses close together. But as you described in the book,
there are only 5 houses.
Only 5 houses. It was new. It would be like
Yeah.
a subdivision, just with a few houses. But I could only imagine the scene once the neighbors outside knew that there was a dead woman inside, like you said, like baked chicken, like the fire chief said. They dragged Albin out on the roof.
Out of the window, yeah.
Then
so there's on top of a porch. There would be So the porch, and all of those houses have porches. So they came out the window and then brought him down and put him on a cot outside, and then it became, I guess, such a big public scene that they brought him back inside the house because the fire was out, and put him on a couch.
I mean, it's just when you describe. Yeah, I'm glad they brought him back in because, like you described it, I mean, he's on a cot. His legs were twitching. You mentioned the gashes, and so anyway, that to me is just wild, So you have that scene in your head, all of that commotion and all of that awfulness. Well, you won't believe who happened to stumble upon all of that. You'll hear about it next. Speaking of the scene, Cecilia's mother, Mrs. Henderson. What is her first name again? I forgot. Anyway, Mrs. Henderson, Cecilia's mother, just so happened to be pulling up to visit her daughter's.
Yeah, she took the train.
And the train, our listeners on Marion Street literally runs parallel. The Grand Trunk Railroad track.
Christina Henderson. Yeah, the train tracks are right behind the house.
Uh-huh.
There's an alley behind the houses on that side of the street. And a train tracks there, and it was like 23 miles or something. I've got that in the book.
Yeah.
Between Kingsbury, and she was coming up to a visit, and so she gets there, and she discovers that her daughter is dead. And she was one of the first visitors of Albin in the hospital.
That's my next question. Talk about it.
Yeah. Well, she shows up at the hospital, and Albin's in Epworth Hospital, EPWORTH, which actually, when you see a picture of it, it looks like a big older house.
Correct.
And he was in the jail ward of the hospital. So they did have an area of the hospital for prisoners.
Uh-huh.
And he's in the hospital, and his brother, I think his brother is there, and I know they had a policeman guarding it, and maybe his brother, Gustav's wife, may have been there too. And Christina Henderson shows up and wants to talk to Albin. Yep. And Albin says, "Well, what does she want?" And because he wasn't sure about letting her in,
right?
But she came in, and she just wanted to make sure that she could be the administrator of the estate. She didn't come in with a knife or anything,
right,
to attack him.
But just when I read that, and that's my next question, was the mother of the woman who got murdered went to the suspected murderer's hospital. I mean, just amazing. And like you said in the book, really, it's just she was calm and everything. She really just wanted to be the administrator or whatever. That is crazy. And it just goes to show that this was a completely different time. The mother of the woman who was beaten with a potato masher and set on fire visited the person accused of killing her in the hospital. And he mentioned that Albin was at Epworth Hospital. That is Memorial Hospital in downtown South Bend now. Obviously, there's a lot more to this story than just the day of the murder. And when you all go out and read the book, you'll discover that he describes what occurred after the murder with the trial and all of that, but he also describes the days leading up to the murder. So next, I wanted to share a story that Gary wrote about in the book that took place the night before the murder. And this will give you a sense of how jealous Albin was and led him to commit the horrific crimes that you just heard about.
And I was really interested in the downtown because of the important part of the story that happened the night before, and that was downtown.
Yep, that was in the boarding house. Is that?
Well, talking about Albin spying on Cecilia and her sister Jean, talking to the bridge man.
Yep.
His name is Ackerman, and Albin was standing in front of the Milburn House, which was a hotel on the southeast corner, just back a little bit. I think there's a bank on the southeast corner, but just back a little bit.
Yep, First Source.
Milburn House, and then kitty corner across that street, there was a drugstore, Graham's Southside Drugstore. Mr. Graham was a smart pharmacist. He had stores on both sides
of the river.
And Albin had followed the two women downtown, and they weren't supposed to be going that far, but he followed them downtown, and he saw them talking to the bridge man, who his real name was Ackerman, and we never did discover what his first name was, but talking to him at the opposite corner. And it was near dusk, and he sees a policeman by the name of James Anderson at the corner, and he goes to the policeman. He says, "Do you know who those women are?" And it's getting dark, so the patrolman walks halfway into the street, into the intersection of Second and Main, and to get a good look. And he comes back and he says to Albin, "Well, that's your wife. I see her downtown all the time." And of course, Albin, I'm sure he's thinking, "Yeah, I bet you do." And Albin tells the policeman that I want you to get a good look at that, because just in case something happens, and I don't remember if that was the exact quote, but something very similar to that. Just in case something happens. And of course, something did happen the next day.
Yep. Yeah, the bridge man. He was working on the new Main Street Bridge, which is still there. Yeah, Albin was quite jealous. When you read the book, you'll read more about that as well. He mentioned 2nd and Main Street. That's Lincoln Way in Maine. The Phoenix Bar is right there, and the new Mishawaka City Hall, the old Liberty Mutual building, is right there as well. Again, there's a lot more to all of this than just what you'll hear in this episode, but I thought it was important to point out a little bit of Albin's jealousy. Next, Gary provides some of Cecilia's traits that probably got Albin a bit jealous. Then he talked about how strange it was that they were married in the first place.
Yeah, Cecilia, and I'll make this clear to your listeners, nobody deserves to be murdered.
Nope.
But Cecilia probably deserved to be divorced.
Right.
She was a, politely to say,
modern woman. Oh, again.
Yeah, modern woman. Yeah,
that's your chapter in the end.
That story ran in the paper on the day of her death, and which I found it amusing.
Wow.
But yeah, she was flirtatious, if not promiscuous.
Right. And
poor Albin. Albin had a temper.
Yeah.
Cecilia had a temper.
Yep.
They were mismatched physically in size. Cecilia was bigger than he was.
Wow.
It was just a strange marriage. And it's still a mystery to me how they found each other. And she was divorced. She was living as a domestic for a reverend. I think his name was H.B. Townsend in Elkhart.
Yep.
And they met and Albin was was running a saloon that he'd
Yep.
bought in Elkhart, that he apparently went broke running a saloon, and how in the world they met and fell in love.
A brief word from one of our sponsors. I want to thank Augie's Locker Room for sponsoring this episode. If you've never been to Augie's, let me tell you. Augie's Locker Room is a Notre Dame sports memorabilia and gift shop. And folks, the words memorabilia and gift shop really don't sum up the place. You walk into Augie's, and it is literally like a Notre Dame sports museum. From leather helmets to autographed footballs, championship rings, game-worn cleats and gear, and even my favorite football player ever, Joe Montana's jersey. Augie's Locker Room is located a quarter mile from Notre Dame at 1811 South Bend Avenue. If you're familiar with Studebagels or Tap House on the Edge restaurant, it's right in that same plaza. I highly recommend that you stop by Augie's Locker Room. If you have a loved one in your life that's a Notre Dame fan, stop by and find that perfect original gift for them. If you're a Notre Dame fan, stop by Augie's and buy that perfect gift for yourself. You deserve it. And at the same time that you're shopping and looking at all the historical memorabilia, you might learn something you didn't know about Notre Dame sports history from Jim, the owner. He's a great dude, very knowledgeable, and most importantly, passionate about Notre Dame and the South Bend and Mishawaka area. Again, check out Augie's Locker Room at 1811 South Bend Avenue. Their phone number, get this, 574-277-ND. So 574-277-6363. Check them out at their website, augieslockerroom.com. And I also put that link into the show notes so you can check them out there. Or you can find them on Facebook, Augie's Locker Room. Now, back to the episode. Albin was ultimately convicted of Cecilia's murder and sentenced to prison. Even though he was convicted of beating his wife with a wooden potato masher, then setting her body on fire, slicing himself all up, he was paroled after 16 years in prison. Next, Gary describes that and how they found out how Albin was buried in an unmarked grave. Albin was paroled. And
Yes.
when our listeners read this book, if you're like me, there's nothing was going through my head at all that this man would be paroled. It was a given. Once he was guilty, he's in jail the rest of his life, if not the death penalty, but at least the rest of his life. The dude was paroled in 1950, 16 years later, and then he died in 1954?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And that was something that in my research that I was asked by the publisher, is this normal? 16 years, just
Right.
like Matt, what you're asking. And it turned out it was.
Wow.
Of the 12 or 13 similar murders that I found during that decade in Indiana, if they didn't hang you, you got out after 15, 16 years.
Wow.
And there were some who were hanged. You know, if the guy went into a department store and shot his wife to death publicly, you get hanged.
Right.
But 15, 16 years was pretty common.
Wow. I mean, I just found that amazing. And then I found it just amazing that here is some old retired guy in the 50s, and you had said something about he might have just died a lonely old man, or I don't know, but it was wild.
because he's in an unmarked grave.
Yeah.
In Rice Cemetery in Elkhart, and we could not find an obituary anywhere.
Wow.
A death notice anywhere. That was something where I went personally to the microfilm of the Elkhart Truth at the library to look for, and we went through. We could not find.
Wow.
And one of his descendants who helped me with the book. It would not be a direct descendant. She found it in a book that the funeral home published of people it had buried.
Oh, wow.
And that's where we got the Social Security. I couldn't find anything in Social Security records.
I love history, and especially our local history, because it's close and accessible at any given time. If I know of a place or something of some historical significance from our area, I can literally drive out to those places myself and just imagine what it was like at whatever moment in time. And where this horrific murder took place is literally in the middle of a city now and only about 3 miles from my house. So, of course, I wanted to check out exactly where it occurred and just try to imagine what that whole area looked like at that time. The murder took place in a house on the north side of Marion Street between Christie Ann and Sarah Street. So I've walked or driven past it several times, and since it's in the middle of a residential neighborhood, and also the fact that the house is still standing and has people living in it, you just can't stand and stare in the middle of the street. You kind of have to be discreet as you walk past. And as you'll hear next, there is still some question over what exact house it is. The actual house that the murder took place in. Now, here's the deal. When I originally read the book a few years ago, I had driven down Marion Street and got to know, narrowed it down to a few homes, which I think it would have happened in. Then in the book, you had also mentioned that you didn't give the address out in the book either. So then once I got to newspapers.com, a few months ago, I just literally Googled the address. And of course, it's in the newspaper, and it's still a home. It's still on Marion Street. So I went out there. I walked my dog. I just walked around, and I was like, wow, this is the house. So then, maybe. So then that's the day I tweeted something, and you had mentioned in a reply like, well, we don't know what house it is because Mishawaka might have changed the addresses. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, it came out in the trial that the addresses were changed in between the time of the murder and the trial.
Uh-huh.
That wasn't the address of the house. So you start to thinking about this and writing the book. Well, the who knows if the addresses had been changed again? I mean, they could have been. It's been 110, 120 years. They could have been changed back. So it's not it's not safe to say which house it was. Plus, there's people living in the house, and I talked my way into the house that I thought it was, and the owner and I really handled it badly. Well, if he's listening again, I apologize. I said, well, we're stalking. We're outside the house and waiting for him to come home from work.
Wow.
And I say, hey, I want to, any chance I could see your house? My great grandmother was murdered in your house. And he goes, oh, I wish they had told me that. And that really
my gosh.
But he did let me in the house. And I went upstairs into the closet. So I could say I've been in the closet, except. You read the book.
Uh-huh.
There is, we know the addresses may have changed. There is a big clue in the book as to which house that might be. I am behind my screen right now. I've spent the last half an hour looking at a picture of the houses on that street, one that I took. And it could be any one of 4 houses.
Wow.
Because there were 5 houses on the street, and I've looked, there are 4 houses, and they looked like they could have been built by the same contractor. It's a little bit different designs, but they could have been. The addresses have changed.
Mm-hmm.
There is a clue in the book. Which one? I now think, of course, these houses could have been remodeled over 100 years ago too.
Mm-hmm.
But if you read the book, you get an idea of, gosh, could it be that house because of a feature in the front of the house? So I will leave it at that.
We will leave it at that. We will leave it at that. My, oh my. Could you imagine being a homeowner and some random guy shows up and says that his great grandmother was brutally murdered in your bedroom closet and set on fire? Woo! For the remainder of the episode, we talk about writing the book, and he shares some of the ups and downs of it all. Next, Gary talks about not even knowing if he had enough material to even write a book, and then he describes the moment that he knew exactly when he had it.
But I was just so fascinated by this story. I wanted to know what I had, and I didn't know if there was a book there.
Yeah.
I didn't know if there was a magazine article. So we make this first trip to South Bend and Mishawaka and Kingsbury and even Elkhart.
And you say we, it's you and your wife?
Ellen and I, yeah.
Okay.
And again, who is as talented a journalist as I am. And so we make this first trip, and one of our stops was the St. Joseph County Archives.
Okay.
And we were looking for the trial transcript.
Okay.
And we never saw a real person in the archives building, and we just were shouting to someone who was working in back.
Lord.
And I'm looking for a trial transcript from 1907, and she said, "Oh, we throw out felony cases after 55 years," and that was a real low point.
Yeah.
In that, I had, thanks to the Mishawaka Penn Harris Library Heritage Center and the supervisor there, and I'll mispronounce her name, but I think it's Deanna Jude, who was enormously helpful. We had microfilm of the Mishawaka Enterprise and the two South Bend newspapers, daily newspapers of that time, the South Bend Daily Times and the Tribune. Yeah, still exists.
Yep.
So, I mean, we had a lot of information for that, but I wanted a trial transcript. So that was a really, really low point.
Okay.
And it's one of two low points in this journey. So we get back here to Southwest Missouri in the Ozarks, which again is a good 9-hour drive. And I start doing checking the Indiana State Archives online.
Okay.
And I found out that I could order prison mugshots.
Okay.
So I think they were $15 a piece or something. So I ordered a mugshot of Alvin Ludwig, who was the second husband of the killer. So I get a mugshot of Alvin Ludwig. So I order these mugshots, and I start an email correspondence with a fellow named Michael Vettman. And Michael was an archivist for the Indiana Records, Indiana Archives and Records Administration, and he became my hero. In my email conversation, as I ordered these mugshots, I said, if you are ever in the Indiana Supreme Court archives, this case was appealed to the Indiana Supreme Court. There was no appellate court at that time, so it went straight from the circuit court, Supreme Court. And I said, I'm looking for the trial transcript. And I figured, well, if it didn't exist in one place, it's not
right.
Of
course, yeah.
So barely a week later, I get a phone call from Michael, and Mr. Sosniecki, I've got it.
Wow!
Holy cow! So, and this is, it's getting to be fall, and the weather is turning bad, and I said, okay, as soon as we can, we're going to Indianapolis to see it. So that, when we went to Indianapolis on that trip, and that was January of 2017, had to wait for the snow to clear. That was when I really knew I had enough material for a book.
Next, Gary shares what the biggest challenge of writing the book was. What were some challenges in writing the book?
Well, the biggest challenge is that you guys are 9 hours away from me.
And that's funny you said that, Gary, because I have a question later on about the challenges of trying to research a book and write a book being that far. So let's go for it.
Well, all right. Well, initially, of course, back in 1996,
Right.
there wasn't a newspapers.com or an
Right.
ancestry.com or genealogybank.com was the third software that I used. That didn't exist until I started again in
Uh-huh.
retirement. But but you guys, when I really started doing the research
Mhm.
and needed to make trips to Indiana,
Mhm.
um, you're a long way, and I thought I
How
thought, "Gosh, I should have been writing about one of the murders I covered here in Missouri as a reporter."
right. And that had to have been a challenge living 9 hours away and writing a factual based nonfiction book. Speaking of traveling to the area, I asked him what his first impressions were of the South Bend and Mishawaka area. And he also described how important it was for him to walk through the city to get a sense of the whole area. It would be hard to tell the story of Cecilia's death and everything surrounding that. It'd be hard to tell that just from your home, like you had to travel here. Um,
Yes.
what, and you had to hear specifically to the Princess City herself, the city of Mishawaka. What were your first impressions of our area here in northern Indiana?
Um, I had made one trip to Indiana to Northern Indiana as a kid.
From
My
Chicago,
dad
so it is close.
Chicago, yeah, my
Yeah.
my my dad took me on a business trip once to Elkhart.
Uh huh.
So that was my one experience there. Um, I've traveled all over the country.
Yeah.
Mishawaka seemed like a very nice city with the river going through it.
Right.
Um, I did a lot of walking on my last trip to Mishawaka before I'd finished writing the book.
Hmm.
I walked all the distances that are described in the book
Right.
so that I knew how how long in minutes it would have taken Alvin to go to Graham's North Side drugstore. How long it
Yes.
would have taken Cecilia and her sister to walk to what was called the Four Corners the night
Yes.
before. So I did all of that. So I got to see a lot of pretty stuff.
And that's ironic you mentioned that because obviously 1906, I mean, there weren't automobiles or anything like that. And so that's the majority of the way that they got around. And everything was in that area, but it's still not close up at
Yeah,
Albin and Cecilia's house, all the way south down to the Four Corners you mentioned, which is to our listeners, it's Lincoln Way and Main Street now. Um,
yeah, it was
Bridge Street.
Second Street back
Oh,
before it was
Second
like,
Street. You're right. It was
yeah,
Second Street.
yeah.
Um,
I had to look that up again today.
As you probably know by now, I'm kind of addicted to researching old newspaper articles because you can learn tons and really get a feel for what it was like at the time. Next, Gary and I talk about that and how the great majority of this book was written based off of newspaper articles at the time. I asked him how hard it was to craft a story based just off of the articles. And the like we talked about, there's no internet, there's no television, heck no radio. The great bulk of your research came from newspapers and from
Yes,
the,
that's
the trial
wonderful.
transcripts,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, we had a journalism teacher. He taught history and principles of journalism by the
Uh-huh.
name of Dr. William Howard Taft. So, it was a great name. He was
Uh-huh.
probably born in the Taft presidency, and he taught us that newspapers are a tool for historians.
Mhm.
And when I've done my public speaking about the book, I repeat that and say, what are we gonna do? What are historians gonna do if newspapers cease to exist? And then, of course, being a journalist, what are we all going to do if
Right.
newspapers cease to exist? And
Right.
I do worry about that.
So much information is packed in there. I mean,
Yeah.
tons. However, you still, in doing all of that research, you had to craft the story. It's, you could throw 20 newspaper articles on somebody's desk and you still couldn't craft the story. I mean, so how hard was that to take in all of that information and then tell it in a book? And you did a great job of telling the story.
Thank you. Thank you. It wasn't well, there was a lot of labor involved,
Uh-huh.
but structuring it wasn't difficult because I'd
Okay.
spent, 43
True.
years as a newspaper reporter. I owned newspapers, but I
Uh-huh.
also wrote during most of that time.
True.
And once I knew what my lead was,
Okay.
which became the first chapter. When you're doing an interview when I'm doing an interview for a newspaper, I'll make a note. I'll take a pen and write in my notes, lead. When I'm doing that interview, that's most important. That's where I'm starting with. And I knew what I was going to start with in this book, which was the night before, because I think that what happened the night before was dramatic. So from that point on, I talked about the history of the families,
Yeah.
which the publisher made me cut down significant. No, it wasn't a publisher made me cut that down. One of my beta readers. I guess that's where I'm not a real author, but the beta readers, the people you send it to. Hey, what do you think here? You got to cut that down.
Okay.
So I did that, and then I went pretty chronologically through the story.
Yeah, it's hard to take a ton of information like that and craft something that the reader can understand, and he definitely does a real good job of that in the book. Next, Gary tells you all where to go buy his book. All right, well, hey, where can our listeners purchase the book? Where's the best spot for them to go?
Well, I need to mention my publisher first. The Kent
Okay.
State University Press website sells it,
Okay.
but they can go on to Amazon
Okay.
and Barnes & Noble. They can go to the
Okay.
Mishawaka Barnes & Noble. It won't be in stock there. I wish it was.
Uh-huh.
It probably is not in stock there, but you can order it through Barnes & Noble. They can get it. So just about anywhere where you can order a book, you can get it.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. I truly appreciate you spending your valuable time listening. A huge thank you to Gary Sosniecki for meeting and sharing your journey writing the Potato Masher Murder. Gary, if you ever need anything up here in sunny northern Indiana, let me know. Folks, go out and buy his book. As you just heard for the last 45 minutes, I highly recommend it. And I do need a few favors from you, from our listeners. If you like the show, please share it with others that you think would appreciate it. You can text them the show link. Let them know that they can check it out on all of the podcast platforms. Also, follow us on Twitter at Round the Bend Pod or on Facebook, Round the Bend Now and Then. Follow us on the original Twitter account at Round the Bend 574. If you have any feedback, let me know. If you have any ideas for episode topics, let me know. If there's something that you think I can improve upon, let me know. Email me, roundthebend574@gmail.com, or message me on Twitter or Facebook. Thank you again for joining us as we learn more about South Bend and Mishawaka's Now and Then.